So now the job interview. So this means that you had a awesome resume, that you filled out the application, and now you've been invited to say more about who you are. So the assumption should be that you're a fit for the job. They would not have pulled you in and spent time interviewing you if you were not a fit for the job, if you were not qualified. So now you need to prepare for the interview. Um, and so in this workshop, we're going to talk about preparing for the interview, about various types of interview, how to communicate your best self, both image-wise and other, how to answer some key interview questions, how to handle difficult questions. We're going to talk about a method called STAR, which will help you with those, and what to do after the interview. So now we're going to go on to prepping for the interview. You should always, 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 always prep. This is not something you do off the cuff, and that starts with if it's a virtual interview, where are you going to do it? What is your background going to be? Are there going to be people in the house? Um, Figure that all out before the interview. If it's an in-person interview, maybe you need to take a dry run um, to the place where you're going to be interviewed. And I would say do it during the time that your interview is going to be because traffic varies. If I drive I live in Southeast Minneapolis. If I drive to Eagan during a Saturday night, the traffic is much different than if I do it Monday morning during rush hour. So make sure you know about that. Make sure you know what door to go in. Make sure you know if there's elevators, if you're going to have to walk up or down. Just check all that out. That's one less thing to worry about. Also, do your homework about the company. Go to their website. Find out their mission. Find out what they do. Find out if they do volunteer stuff. Find out about employees. Sometimes you'll realize that the person who's interviewing you has a profile on the company page. Figure that all out. If you have been given a list of the people who will be at the interview, see if they're on LinkedIn. Know something about their background. Check all that out. Reread the job posting. Reread your resume. Make sure that you know what's in your resume. Make sure you know what they're looking for and that you can address those issues. Also, get a good night's sleep. I know that's really hard. Um, Eat something before you go to the interview. There's, nothing more embarrassing than your stomach becoming part of the interview, but don't eat anything new. You have one chance to make a good impression. To get out your clothes ahead of time. I always get them out the night before, and I always have a second alternative. Not all the time, but a lot of the time I have a second alternative because I might feel different in the morning. If you're short on funds to get an interview outfit, your Career Force Center might have resources. There are agencies that help people have their interview uniform. So they'll help you with clothes, both men and women. So check out that with your local Career Force Center. But do not go to the job cold and wanting to do this off the cuff. Sheila, are there any questions before I go on?
None at this time, Sandra.
Awesome. All right. So now we'll talk about the types of interviews. The phone screening is usually just HR kind of verifying what you have on your resume, seeing if you would be a good fit for the company overall. Um, they're usually just asking very basic questions about job qualifications. And it's always good to schedule them. So somebody might call and say, are you available for a phone screening now? It's totally okay to say, no, this is not a good time. Can we schedule it? And then when they do call, I would be dressed up. I wouldn't do a phone screening in my PJs. And I would also make sure that I'm smiling on the phone. People won't know that you're smiling because they won't see it, but they'll hear it in your voice. And if you don't believe that, I would call a friend and talk to them smiling and talk to them not and see if they can pick up the difference. The attitude that you bring to the interview is your most important asset. And that includes all components of the interview, from the phone screening to the in-person screening to the selection process. It's your attitude because right now in the interview process, they're checking to see if you're a good fit for the team, if you're somebody that they want to work with, if you would be as wonderful as the employees they already have. So an in-person screening usually comes with a set of questions. A lot of places, the state of Minnesota asks the same set of questions to all the people that they interview, and the people who are asking the questions don't usually ask follow-up questions. So you need to be able to answer that question and to sell yourself the best you can. A selection interview is usually multiple interviews. I've talked to people who, on their third or fourth interview, they're different people within the interview. So that means you made it past the first interview. And now they want to make sure that you're really a fit. Behavioral interviews we'll talk about a little bit further down. It's to get a grasp of how you behave in certain situations. So they'll ask you, tell me a time when you had a tight deadline. How did that happen? Tell me a time when you were working with multiple priorities. Tell me a time when you were working with an employee that was hard to work with. So they'll ask you questions and they'll want to know how you behave. A work sample is if you're applying for a welding job, they'll probably ask you to do a weld. Or if you're a graphic artist, they might ask for samples of your work. A group or a peer interview might be going out for lunch with people that you would be working with. The interview is constant. Also, keep in mind that your interview doesn't start when the person who said they were going to interview you is there. It starts when you get to the place. It starts with every person that you meet, and especially the receptionist. So, how you treat that person, how you show up while you're waiting, from the minute you walk in the building, your interview starts. And I've worked at places where we've interviewed somebody and they've been absolutely wonderful, and we go talk to the receptionist and they say, oh, they were rude when they checked in, or they were on their cell phone while they were waiting and they were loud. I would, if I was you, I would put my cell phone in the car and not bring it even in to the interview with me. And putting it on vibrate is not a good solution because vibrate is really loud, especially in an interview, especially in a room where there might be pauses. So you do not want your phone to be a component of your interview. So you want to communicate your best image. You want to send 80%, sometimes 90% of your image is communicated by nonverbal. So how you stand, how you walk, how you eye contact or no contact is important. You want to communicate your best image. You want to bring copies of your resume. I would say bring 5 copies of your resume. And you might say, why? Why do that? I submitted my resume. An example was I was at at an interview, and sorry about the background chatter. The interviewer came out and said, I'm sorry, we have to reschedule your interview. Our copier broke and nobody was able to print off a copy. And I said, well, I have 5 copies. Will that be enough? And I got the interview and I got the job. So it shows that you're organized, right? Bring samples of your work. Do arrive 10 to 15 minutes early. Don't arrive earlier than that because that's kind of creepy. And you want to be prepared if you need to take notes during your interview. So you might want to bring a tablet or something. And you should always bring 3 references. You never know if you need them. And you want to be proactive. So you want to finish strong. So you want to have questions to ask at the end. And part of your email will include a list of interview questions. Sheila, did I see that there's questions?
Yeah, there are a couple. I was asking one to clarify. She had asked, what if you have a phone or Zoom interview for a remote position?
So that's a virtual, and that's where when I talked earlier about checking your background, you don't want to, and to make sure that you're in a quiet room. If you have animals, they do not need to be part of the interview. And if you have children or people at home, make sure that they know that you're not to be disturbed. But again, you want to dress up. And people say they only dress up the top part, but you never know when you might have to stand or something. So I would dress completely as if it was an in-person interview. And more and more companies are doing the first screening virtually because that saves time, right? Other
Yeah.
questions?
Yeah, and I guess what she was saying is that, when there's examples given, like, showing your work, if you need a work sample or,
Oh,
how
okay.
to present yourself in person. She was saying most of the suggestions given are more for in-person interviews rather than remote. And how
Right.
would you address some of those if you were doing a virtual
So
interview?
if you have a virtual portfolio, so many people in the creative fields have virtual portfolios, you can enter the link to that in the chat. Um, if they're not going to do a virtual interview if they need a work sample of a weld, right? You know that that's going to be an in-person. The resume you can't really deal with. You can have it available, and if they need to see it, you can do share screen. So I would have it keyed up and ready to share if they need that. Work samples of anything that you have as a file on your computer can be shared virtually with the shared screen option. I've never talked to anyone or had a virtual interview where they've asked for that, but it's always good to be prepared. So if one of the requirements is that you're going to be designing websites, you might have to want the URLs of websites that you've done. So you can pop those into the chat. Is that helpful?
Those were good examples for that. Yes, yes, she says.
Awesome. Are there other questions about prepping?
There's one other, but I'm gonna hold off on it till we get to the part about interview questions.
Okay.
Okay.
Again, I cannot overemphasize your attitude. How you show up is so important. Smile. You don't you want to be true to yourself. So you don't want to be overly bright if you're not bright, but you want to be positive. You want to show that you have energy. Nobody wants to hire someone who comes off as, I'm sorry, anybody with a name of Debbie, but Downer Debbie, or who doesn't have any energy, because what kind of an employee will you be? Um, so in handling tough questions, we suggest something called the sandwich method, where you start with the positive, then you say what the negative is, and then you end with a positive. People tend to remember what was said last and what was said first. You need to anticipate those questions. So we will send you a list of tough questions that you can prep for. You can Google. them, and you can also Google answers. But the issue with Googling answers is that you don't want to give a set answer. You want to always personalize it to yourself because people know that those questions are out there. So if somebody asks you, talk about one of your weaknesses, right? You're not going to want to say, oh, I don't have any weaknesses. Or, um, you know, a pat answer that's out there on the web. You want to always personalize it for yourself. So being prepared is Googling those questions and looking at our list that we're going to send you and talking, have somebody ask you those questions because saying the answer in your head is different than saying the answer out loud. So be prepared, but always be positive and always be honest and keep it brief, right? And focus on the skills that are in the posting. So if the posting says how do you know that you need to meet deadlines, then if you answer the question, answer it that you in a way that highlights something that they're looking for. So a question would be an example would be, tell me about a weakness. Um, and I could answer, and then in the job posting, it said, being able to meet deadlines. So I used to think that I was a procrastinator because I was always up against deadlines and rushing to meet them. And I took an assessment when I taught at Stillwater Prison. We gave this assessment called True Colors. And I found out that I was a blue. No, I was a green. I was a green. And green people are all into knowledge. They can never get enough. They're lifetime learners. They're always learning. And what I came to learn was that I wasn't a procrastinator. I always felt I needed one more bit of knowledge, one more bit of information, one more interview. So going forward, after I learned that is I set myself two deadlines. One deadline is this is when I have to stop the research. This is when whatever information I have at that point, it's enough. And the other is the real deadline. And I make sure that they're far enough apart so that I'm not slammed up against the real deadline. So I said the positive and the negative, and then I end it with the positive that I've learned to manage that problem. But you want to focus on skills and you want to be brief. Another question that you get asked a lot is, tell me something about yourself. Again, you don't want to say that you have 5 children, that you're caring for an elderly parent, that you've been in the workforce for 40 years. You want to focus on things that are germane to the job posting. So if the job is about working with computers and coding, you could say you love coding ever since you learned about it. You've done X, Y, and Z to learn more about it. And what's your favorite part about coding? Because one of the things when you ramble and you talk too much about who you are personally is that they find out information that they don't need to know, and that's not legal to ask, right? So you want to stay brief and you want to focus on the skills that are needed for the job. And you want to be comfortable with pauses. It's okay after you've been asked a question to pause or to even ask the question back because that gives you time to think it through. Um, so one of the ways to do that is the star situation. The star, how you answer a question with star. The situation, the task, the action, and the results. And I also gave you that example with being thought of as a procrastinator. Another situation would be tell me a time when you had to work with a difficult coworker. So the situation was that we were on a committee together, a project together, and all of a sudden I wasn't able to communicate with with this coworker, and they weren't communicating with me. And so the task was that we had to work together. And so my action was to reach out to that person and say, I've noticed that our working relationship has changed slightly, and you haven't been communicating with me all the information that needs to be. And she's apologized and said that she was a little bit distracted, and that going forward, she would make sure that I was communicated with. So I said what the situation is, the task that we needed to finish, and the action that I took to do that. But you always want to be positive. You always want to be professional. You always want to end on a positive, and you always want to turn whatever happened into a plus, right? This happened. This wasn't cool. This wasn't exciting. This didn't really work well, but we made it work. And so you have the option of picking situations that worked, right? We've all worked at jobs where, to our best ability, we've not been able to correct things, but we all have examples of things that we've been able to correct. So you need to have those in your head or written out in front of you. You all need to practice those. And just again, look at the questions that you might be given, look at your resume, and see how you can highlight how your skills fit into the position, and how you can highlight how you can use your skills to meet the position's requirements and show how you can be a good team member. How are we doing, Sheila?
We're doing good. There's one question. You had talked about the different types of interviews, like the behavioral or the group.
Right.
They want to know that if you're invited for an interview, is it okay to ask what type of interview it will be?
Definitely. That shows that you're trying to be prepared, right? And it's even okay to ask who would be there, who would be interviewing. Um, I've in the past, when I've gotten the invitation for a virtual interview, they've listed the people who would be there. If they don't do that, you can always ask who will be, if you ask what type of interview it is, you can ask if it's a panel, who else will be there. Um, it's good to ask questions, and it's good not to be afraid to ask questions. And it's also, I forgot to mention that you should check yourself in a mirror, because you never know when that salad you ate for lunch is showing up on your teeth, and you don't want that to be a distraction. Or your blouse is funny, or if you wear a tie, your tie is not correct. Um, you want to show up one step dressed one step above what the company is or the position would be. If it's a tech job, a lot of times those are really casual and people wear t-shirts and jeans. Well, you'd want to wear a polo shirt and maybe a casual sports jacket. Um, or if you're a woman, you might want to wear a blouse with a pin and a blazer. You want to always show up just one step above. And sometimes you can get that information from the company website. Sheila, you have another question?
Yeah, it came in. It's related to what you were talking about, and they just want to know, should you be prepared for any type of interview?
Yes, but if you look at the big picture, what you do to prep for an interview is what you would prep for any interviews. If you're going to do a phone or an in-person or a panel or a work sample, you're going to want to know about the company, right? So you always, even or virtual, you want to research the company. You want to know the mission of the company. You want to know what they do. You don't want to go into an interview and ask, what do you do here? Because then why are you applying there? Or you don't want to say, and I would even Google the news. So Google news stories that company Bright Star is in, right? If that's the company you're applying for. Any interview you go to, you want to do the research. There's nothing worse than going into an interview and them asking you something that you could have found out on their website. And Google the people if you know who they are, because there's nothing worse than asking somebody how long they've been at a company if that's on their LinkedIn profile, right? Because just think about it. If you were hiring, you would want somebody who did their research. You would want somebody, because that meant that that person would do research and find out things for you. You don't want to hire somebody who's not organized. So you need to come in organized. And then for the virtual interview, it's really important because you're creating the environment, right? So what I do is I take art off the wall and I turn my camera up so that I have this plain wall behind me. I test my camera, I test my sound system, I test my internet. So if you do not have strong internet at home, you want to go someplace where they have good internet because there's nothing worse than being in the middle of an interview and your internet dies. And now you can't always control for that. Just last week, I was working at home and I was having a virtual LinkedIn review with somebody, and I heard this pop, and the transformer for my neighborhood died, and I didn't even have lights. So there was no way that I could continue what I'm doing. And so on that end, it might always be good to have a phone number of somebody who's going to be part of the virtual interview. So if something happens, you can call them and say, this is really embarrassing, but my power just went out. Would we be able to reschedule? Is that helpful? I hope so. I would really practice the star system and I would have it in your head. And one of the great things about it is if you get a tough question that you hadn't prepped for, you can just automatically default for this and you can remember it because you can remember star. Situation, task, results. So here are some key questions. We already talked about tell me about yourself and why you're interested in working with this company for this company. You would know that if you did research. I love your mission statement, especially this part of it. And then you can tell them their mission statement. What is your major weakness? So I gave an example of that about my procrastination. What are one of your strengths? Always, always tie that in to the job position. So if part of the job position is that you're going to be doing community outreach and you have to build connections, you can talk about how in a past job or some other part of your life you built connections and what those connections led to. So by just saying, I'm really good at networking and I love to do it, and that's one of my strengths, isn't good enough. I'm really good at networking and it's one of my strengths. And because of this, because I like to network, I was able to connect XYZ vendor with the purchasing company and they ended up being our best vendor for this product. Can you give me an example of how you solved a problem? So that's a great behavior problem. What was the situation? What was the task? And now I forget. I'm sorry. I'm having a brain event. Okay, what was the action that you took? And then what was the results? So the most important part of STAR is your actions and what were the results. Where do you see yourself in 3 years? I was at an interview and somebody told me that they saw themselves owning their own company. That's not somebody I'm going to hire. I'm not going to pour in time and money and energy into someone and then have them be my competitor, right? So if you did research about the company, you could say, I see myself possibly working in this department or having more responsibility here or, learning as much as I can about this department. But you're not going to say that you're going on to another company. And there are many other key interview questions. And a lot of times they have to do specifically with the job. And sometimes you'll even get questions ahead of time sent to you that you can prep for. How we doing? All right. So why did you leave your last job? Is that everybody's favorite question? Why don't people put in chat? Has anybody had an interview where they asked that question? So those of you who had that question, how many of you were prepared to answer it? Anybody, everyone prepared? Cool. Yeah, COVID has helped a lot, hasn't it? Good, most of you were ready. Yep. So you don't need to go into details. If you were let go without cause, you can say the company reorganized and your your job was eliminated. COVID is still a wonderful reason why there was a gap in your resume, in your job history. You do not have to tell them in detail. This can be a quick, brief answer. Right. Yep. So some of you had really great responses. You need to be prepared for this question, but you do not need to be over detailed. And you do not have to even go into detail. It's really none of their business. A lot of places don't even ask it anymore because of what happened with COVID. Any other questions? I'm reading some of your responses. So somebody was fired without cause and doesn't want to answer. You could say that your skills were no longer needed, and so you were let go. You don't ever like want to say anything bad about a past employer. You never want to give details about a bad situation. Even if where you were living was a step above working in hell, you want to always be positive about it. If you talk to a manager, most managers can only say that you work there and that how long you work there.
But Sandra, someone asked, do you prepare different questions for different phases of the interview?
You mean to be able to answer different questions for different phases of the interview?
Yeah.
I think that because every company is different and you can't really guess what questions will be asked at what phases. And a lot of times interviews are conducted by people who don't know how to do an interview. You can never count on it being organized or what will happen when. So the best strategy is just to have answers to questions that are commonly asked. And again, we will send you that list and you can Google a list of questions. And a lot of times those questions vary by industry. So I would even Google top interview questions asked in the pharmaceutical industry, top questions asked of salespeople, top questions asked in interviews of customer service people. Because questions do vary by industry and by position. But because everybody is different, every business is different, there's no prescribed, these questions are always asked in this phase, and these questions are always asked in this phase. I hope that's helpful. So, what are some post-interview steps? I would always reach out to your references. If I always send my references a copy of the job posting, a copy of the resume and the cover letter that I used, and a recap of what was talked about in the interview. And it might even be a good practice to highlight the parts of your resume or of the position that were specifically talked about in the interview, or that you would want them to highlight about your experience if they're contacted. And then I would send a thank you note to the people. You can do that via email. You can do that via mail. During the interview, especially if it's a virtual interview, I would ask people if they felt comfortable to put their emails in the chat. You can always copy and paste that if you want before the end. If you don't have a chance to get it, you might want to call and talk to a receptionist and get that information. I know that it's a little different virtually because you can't ask people for business cards. But it's always good to interview everybody who was there and to address them in their thank you the way that they introduce themselves. So if I was to introduce myself as Ms. Brick, then you would want to do that, or even as Ms. Sandra, you would want to do that in the thank you note. And it's totally fine to do emails. If you want, you can do cards. Some people have thank you notes in their car. If it's an in-person interview, they write the thank you note and then they take it in and give it to the receptionist. That's something, if you're comfortable doing, you could do. It's always to do it as soon as possible after the interview because you don't know how soon they're going to make the decision. If you're the last interview, they might, get together the next day and talk about all the candidates. So you might want to keep that in mind. But you always want to highlight. So thank you very much. It was really great meeting with you. I appreciate it talking about my experience doing X, Y, and Z. I look forward to the next steps. And also that should be one of your your interview, your questions at the end. You always need to be prepared to ask questions at the end of the interview. You might ask, what is the next step if they don't tell you? Is it okay if I call after, when would be the best time to call back to find out where the process is? Other good questions are, what is the day in the life of this person in this position? Or how do you know when the person in this position is successful? You always need to have at least 3 to 5 questions prepared to ask at the end of the interview. And that will also be one of the handouts that we give in the follow-up email. So this has been a particularly quiet group. Sheila, are there any questions?
Yeah, so there's a couple remaining here. So what are your thoughts on thank you notes? Someone brought in thank you cards with them at their last interview, and when it was over, they filled them out and gave them to the receptionist to pass along.
Right, so that's about the going to your car and coming back in that I talked about. I don't know if I would do it right there in the waiting room or during the interview. Um, they also have to be thoughtful. So I wouldn't do it on premises, but you could always walk them back in.
Okay. And then someone says that companies ask on an application if they can call your former employer. And if you know the company will only confirm that you work there for the certain dates, should you always answer yes to that question that they can contact your former employer?
Um, I would say yes, unless you have a good reason. So I have two previous positions. One of them, the company closed. Both of them, the company closed. I'm still in contact with somebody who works there. The other company that closed, I have no idea how to get a hold of the owner. Also, I had a position at Century College, and the woman that I directly worked with is no longer there. So in those cases, I say no because my possible new employer might get frustrated. Trying to get a hold of these people, and I don't have information for them to get a hold of them. So then I say no. Um, that's never gotten in my way previously. So it's something that you have to decide about your comfortability with and if the people can really get in contact with the people.
And a follow-up to that, how much information can your former employer share?
So it's legally, they really can only say that they work there, that you work there and when you work there. But one of the follow-up questions sometimes is, would you rehire this employee? And why or why not? So they're not legally supposed to answer that, but that's something that is sometimes answered. Um, and there are a myriad of reasons why you would not want someone to talk to your previous employer. So saying no is not necessarily a bad thing. I wouldn't let that get in the way of applying for a job. If you don't want them to get a hold of your past employer, say no and see what happens. That's never stopped me from getting an interview.
Okay. And then how about note taking during the interview? How much note taking is really encouraged or discouraged during the interview? I have a disability that makes holding questions in my mind harder, and writing them down is important for me to remember.
Then I would do it. And if you are uncomfortable with doing it, you can always ask. And you don't even have to expose your disability. You can just say, is it okay if I take notes during the interview? Right. You don't have to give them any more information than needed. And I would say 9.9% of the time, they'll say yes.
And is there any way to find out what an employer would say to you, or say to the person that's calling for the reference check on them?
Yeah, well, you can call them. So I had a job where I was let go partially because of reorganization and partially because the job was not a good fit. I mean, I tried it for a year. I did okay, but I didn't perform at the standard that I needed to. And I was very concerned about letting them contact um, the person who was my main supervisor. So I called them and I asked, I said, I'm applying for this job at the state. I told them what the job was, and I said, are you okay being contacted? And they were absolutely fine being contacted. And they were happy that I was finding and this other opportunities. So when push comes to shove, if you're really, really concerned, I would call your former employer and find out.
Okay. And then, Sandra, do you have any thoughts on how you would answer the question? How do you handle or approach working with colleagues from different age groups, cultures, etc.?
Um, so you're people are people. So if you use the STAR method, you could come up with a situation where you did. So the situation is that you're on an intergenerational team. and you have to get a task done. And the action is making sure that everybody has input, that you're not judging people based on any other qualifications other than this is the job and this is their expertise. And then you can talk about the results that happen from taking into consideration everybody's expertise. But I wouldn't focus on the difference in age or, millenniums always do this and Gen Xers always do this and um, my generation does that. I would just focus on the working together and all the different perspectives that are brought to the table by people seeing things differently. An example in my life would be, and it's not even work related. I have a really hard time remembering where I park in a parking ramp. I've lost my car numerous times and I was in a new place and I took the elevator up and I was looking all around trying to memorize where I was. And the security guard came over, and the security guard was obviously somebody in their 20s. And he asked me what I was doing, probably thought I was scoping out the place. And I said, I'm trying to remember where I parked my car. And he said, you have a smartphone, don't you? Why don't you take a picture? And I went, whoa, that is so cool. So different people, no matter how old they are or what they're, if they're BIPOC or not, have different perspectives, and all those perspectives are used to solve problems more creatively, more efficiently. You just never know. Other questions?
Yeah, there's a few more. We have one about when to identify you have a disability. This person has a non-visual disability. Does answering this question honestly eliminate you? I have several health issues, but I also answer no on this because I think it will eliminate me from
Right.
consideration.
So that's not legal for them to ask you about a disability. So that's the first thing. And if somebody who's doing the interview doesn't know that that's not legal, you can just focus on your qualifications to do the job. You don't need to answer that. And if you feel really brave, you could, maybe the person doesn't know, and you could say, it's my understanding that that's not an appropriate question. You don't even have to use the word illegal, an appropriate question to ask during the interview. I would like to tell you about, my strengths and being able to do this job.
Yeah, usually you reveal the disability after you're offered the job in case
Right,
there's an accommodation needed or something like that.
right.
Yeah, exactly. Um, Another question, someone says they are in the dislocated worker program starting web development training. It'll be self-paced and online. Are potential employers turned off by job seekers who are still in training when they apply? The training will augment my digital marketing background.
Um, so you have to ask your question. Do you want to work for a company that doesn't value continual learning, right? So you have to decide the company you want to look at, and you can turn it into a positive. So, the situation is that you're applying in the process of looking for jobs, you realize that you weren't fully qualified, or you were lacking this particular qualification. So your task was to figure out how you could meet that deficit. And I wouldn't even use the word deficit. And the action that you took was to sign up for this class that you're taking. And the results will be that you will finish with a certification that will make you even more qualified and able to do the job. So again, you're turning the negative into a positive. And I know that even for the state jobs, they ask you if you have a disability, but that's not shared with the managers or the hiring process. Um, so and sometimes that's asked because people with disabilities for certain jobs at the state have the ability to have a job for, I think, Sheila, do you remember? Is it 600 or 700 hours? There's that special program.
Oh, yeah,
that-
Connect 700.
Yeah, the Connect
Yep.
700, that you're able to have the job with mentoring for 700 hours to see if you can perform it with whatever disability that you have, to see it. And then, so you have this extra grace period. So it's not always bad to acknowledge. And I know for the Minnesota State, that is not shared with the hiring team. Other questions?
Yeah, someone says they have trouble using the STAR method when for unprepared questions. You're not sure what kind of questions they're going to ask.
Right.
Do you have any advice on how to free form this better?
Free forming is based on your prep. Um, and my favorite example of developing muscle memory is the original Karate Kid with Ralph, whatever his name is, where he had to do wax on with one arm hand and wax off with another. So when he was in the ring, that movement became instinctual. So this is a place where it's practice, 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 and thinking of situations, because the situation that you prepped for might not be exactly like the question, but it might be similar enough. And a good stall technique is to repeat the question back in your own words to make sure that you understand it. And that it also gives you time. And if that seems awkward to you, you can always think about, you know, all these interviews with politicians where they're asked a question and they don't necessarily answer that question directly, but their answer has something to do with the question. You could try that. It's better to answer the question directly and to fold in your skill set. But I would find somebody, we'll send you questions. You can find more questions online. I would find somebody to sit down with and just fire the questions. Um, so you get used to answering questions in that method.
Yeah, and I think that answer, Sandra, is similar for this next question because someone says that during the interview, they often leave out transferable skills that are relevant to the job. So how do you bring this up better? And I think there again, your answer about
Right.
preparation should help
Yep.
with that. But do you have any other
And
suggestions?
that's really important if you're shifting careers. Um, so there's websites um, that have, is it careeronestop.com, that you can go to and you put in one job, you
Career.
put in, one job title and it gives you skills, and you put in another job title and it gives it skills. And then you can compare the two. And so, especially if you're transitioning, you want to make sure you answer the question with skills from situations that you have, but talk about how those skills would transition to the new job. And you can even address that when they ask you, tell me about yourself, or why did you leave your last job? I had developed these skills and now it was time to see if I can use these skills in this particular field. Or I'm interested in a new challenge where I can grow these skills.
We had a couple of questions about asking about a disability on an application because they see it many times on applications and in government jobs. But I'm
Right.
thinking it's probably in the voluntary section, questions that you can
Right.
voluntarily answer.
I know for the state of Minnesota, you can say yes, no, do not want to answer. And saying you don't want to answer is not a red flag. If you're really, really concerned about it, I would contact um, your local career force center, because they know more about the businesses there, and maybe the business is doing something illegal. And so that's good for your local career force center to know about. But your local career force center knows about the businesses where you live, and they'd be able to help you answer that question for your particular situation in your particular location. So we're at 11. You will get this presentation in your email. You will also get a list of Career Force centers that are near you. You'll get interview questions. You'll get questions to ask at an interview. And feel free to reach out to Sheila or myself, and we'll try to answer questions. Thank you very much for spending this hour with us, and good luck, everybody. Knock 'em dead. As they say for the stage, break a leg. Bye.